Hello, everyone. Welcome to another OGT study session. I'm going to try not to make this one so boring, but I really don't know how to do that. But I'm going to do the best that I can. So, I've taken you here to the OGT information guide. This web page has a lot of resources on it to help you study. And I'm going to show you around for a second just so you know how to navigate it. And then we're going to go into some practice tests. I'm going to kind of show you some tricks on how to get past questions and how to find clues that are embedded within the questions to help you answer whatever you're doing. So if you go to the study resources page, you can see it's broken down by subject. Here we'll go to the math tab. And I've got some flashcards here. I'm not super sure how helpful those are, but these preparation web pages are really good. I think there's a couple of them where you can go into them and find out what your weaknesses are, where your strengths are, where you really need to focus. Now, right here we have April Barton's. This is her web page that she's done. She's done specific work with the OGTs. This is an excellent resource, and you should definitely take advantage of this. And there's also these ones that were put together by teachers at Lorraine High School. So these are also very good. The really good thing about like April's channel and these is that they know what's on the OGT and they know what to help you study for. And that goes for all of these. So I've reviewed these here for the science and they've helped me tremendously and they'll help you to just learn how to think through the questions. These are also really good, but there's a ton of resources on here for each of the subjects. And I really encourage you to go through each one of these to help prepare yourself. So for today, we're going to go to the practice test, and here's the link for that. It's the OGT practice test. When you get there, you're going to pull up. Actually, I'm going to log out. I want to show you guys exactly what you're going to see when you log in. So let me try that one more time. This is what you're going to see. You need to come down here and take a test without logging in. And actually, we'll do that. I'll just go ahead and follow that same link. It's exactly the same, even if you had a login. So you have about 5 tests here that have been published. There are more OGT tests than this, but these are the published tests from these years. So today we're going to do the 2009 test. I'm going to go through some of these questions. And on the way, I am going to skip some questions. There's some questions that you just require you to do careful reading and then choosing the most logical answer. And I am going to skip those for the sake of saving time and not to bore you to death, which I'm sure you're going to be bored to death anyway, but it's important, so you have to do it. So strips of 2 different metals are placed in a solution of acid and shown in the picture below. One thing you're going to hear from me time and time again is study these charts before you look at the answers, because the answers are going to try to confuse you. They're going to try to trip you up. But if you understand the charts before you look at them, the chances of that happening are going to be diminished. So let's look at this. You've got 2 metal strips here. You have an acid solution. You don't know what kind of acid is in this. You know nothing about the acid. But then importantly, and these are the little details I'm talking about, you have these looks like the metal strips are connected to an electricity source. So that's important and easy to overlook. So you need to make sure you're paying attention to little details, and I'll show you why. What indicates that ions are being formed? Well, let's pretend right now you don't know what ions are, and you may not know what ions are. But you don't necessarily need to know that to help you choose your answer for this question. So the solution becomes less acidic, the metal strips begin to swell up, and odor is emitted by the acid solution, or an electrical current is present between the metal strips. Now, looking at those answers and knowing that you have an electrical current, obviously, or why would this be connected to an electrical source? You know that D is going to be your answer because they've kind of given you a hint here that this is what's happening here. Now, for the other answers, we don't know anything about the kind of acid that's in here, so we can take those 2 out. And also the metal strips, there's no indication that they're swelling up. But electrical current, we do have a clue that that's what's going on here. So the great thing about these practice tests is once you choose an answer, you're given an explanation below, and it is helpful in helping you understand why that's the right answer. So different metals attract electrons differently, and when such metals are connected by a wire, there's a tendency for electrons to flow from one metal to the other. This flow of electrons is an electric current. When electrons leave a metal strip, positive ions of that metal are formed. Therefore, the flow of electrons current corresponds to formation of positive metal ions. If you remember my diagram of the atom where I talked about the protons and the neutrons here in the middle and the electrons on the outside, and the electrons are just kind of like the children running around everywhere. It's always electrons that do things like conduct electricity and jump from one atom to another. But remember, here's your clue, and look for these kind of little things when you're taking your OGTs. So for question 2, I'm going to skip it. This is a question you'll want to read this carefully and then choose the most logical answer. I'm not going to waste time on these today, but I do want you to get into practice of these to see how well you're understanding what you're reading. Because that's all this is. One thing is if you have trouble with reading comprehension or like it gets confusing to you, I would really recommend you taking your scratch paper and just briefly jotting down what this is saying, because you're going to come across a few of these, and just maybe summarize it in your own head before you go down here and answer the question. It'll help you a lot if you have trouble following it. So here's another one. They always ask these kind of questions though, so we'll just do it. It is another logic question, but I think it's worthwhile going over because they're going to ask this question in one way or another. If you were working for the Center of Disease Control and discovered a new highly dangerous pathogen, what information should be presented to the public that may prevent a widespread epidemic of the disease? Actually, we have this going on now, right? Think about you and your family and the coronavirus. Would you want to know the fatality? What would be the most helpful, I should say? The fatality rate caused by the pathogen, a report on how the pathogen is transmitted from one organism to another, pictures showing microscopic images of the pathogen so they'll be familiar with it, or a description of the surface receptors found on the pathogen and immune response. So the answer here is B. And think about this, you would really be more interested in knowing how that pathogen is transmitted to protect yourself. This one causes panic. This one, I mean, who cares other than the scientists, and this one as well, or maybe you're curious about it, that's great. But that's not really going to help you prevent the widespread epidemic of a disease. So it is how it's transmitted from one organism to another. I've seen this question in one form or another on pretty much every test. So just know that, to think about that. So here's another question that's it's a great one to go over because it's much more intuitive than you probably think. Jackie used a portable electric drill to remove screws from a broken wooden table. He noticed that the screws holding the table together were warm to the touch after being removed from the wood. What explains this phenomenon? Now, I did not tell you guys at this beginning, but if you don't have a pen and paper with you right now, I want you to put this on pause and I want you to go grab one or grab a pen and paper because I'm going to I need you to write some of these down that's going to help you remember this. Okay. So, mechanical energy from the drill was converted into thermal energy due to friction. And now, anytime you see thermal energy, it might be super helpful for you to replace that word or these words with the word heat. So mechanical energy from the drill was converted into heat due to friction. Electrical energy from the drill was converted into chemical energy due to resistance. Heat or thermal energy from the drill was converted into mechanical energy due to inertia, or the process of removing the screw concentrated the thermal energy, heat, that was already present in the wood. So let's go over these answers really quickly. The answer is A, and that is because an electric drill is mechanical energy. It's a machine, and it's converted into heat due to friction. So that's the act of the screw drilling the screw out of the wood makes it hot because of the friction against the wood. But let's look at these real quick. Electrical energy, that's coming from a source of electricity. So it's a little different, but also there's not necessarily there's no chemical energy being released here, and definitely not due to resistance. And heat from the drill is converted into mechanical energy due to inertia. No, the process of removing the screw concentrated the thermal energy that was already present. Well, there's not heat already present in the wood. It needs to be creative. But I want you to write down mechanical energy, machine, thermal energy, heat, electrical energy, electricity, and chemical energy is energy released from chemical reactions. This should really help you with these kinds of questions. So we're always going to have biology questions. They do ask about cells and different ways. We went over in the previous slide prokaryote cells and eukaryote cells. Haven't really gone over plant cells much, and maybe that's something that in the future definitely need to do. I do think there's a question on the OGT about plant cell respiration that usually has to do with photosynthesis, but it could also be asking about ATP. So if you see that question, I'm not sure what the question is, but maybe I'll do a follow-up video for that. What structure is absent in the cells of fungi, thereby preventing them from performing photosynthesis? Cilia, nuclei, chloroplast, or mitochondria? Now the answer to this is chloroplast. Chloroplast, photosynthesis, and plants are always going to be connected. This is actually absent in the cells of fungi because a fungi is actually not a plant or an animal. It's a species all into of itself. So what's absent in fungi are these chloroplasts. So fungi cannot perform photosynthesis. But if you get your pen and paper, and I would write photosynthesis equals chloroplast. If you don't know that, these two are always directly related to each other. The chloroplast is what synthesizes the photosynthesis in a plant. Really important. Cilia, we went over. Remember, those are the hair-like structures on a cell. Helps it move. Nuclei in the nucleus in the middle. And mitochondria is a more complicated organelle of the cell, most in eukaryote cells. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to go over these questions because really the formula for how to answer these questions is critical. And it's so much easier than you can even imagine. So one thing about these kind of questions is you have to get used to thinking about them. So when you're looking at multiple choice questions, you're just choosing the right answers. So it's often a process of elimination or thinking through the answers. But these ones you have to think completely on your own and out of the box. And at first they can be a little intimidating. So it's something you have to get used to doing. But also there's a formula when you answer these that I'm going to show you. So state two factors and explain how each influences the weather in Ohio. The first thing you always want to do when you answer these is restate your question. You're going to get points just for doing that. So we're going to say one factor that influences the weather in Ohio is, and I'm just going to tell you, or we're going to say our pressure belts. Pressure belts move the air and create, we're going to say weather patterns that could bring wind or precipitation to the area, we'll just say. Okay, another factor that influences the the weather. If I could type, it would make it much easier. In Ohio is Lake Erie. Lake Erie puts moisture into the air, cools the I'm going to do this to save time, cools the temperatures, and so on and so forth. So one thing that you always want to pay attention to with these is that you're answering the question completely. So once you've answered it, go back and make sure you've answered the question completely. So did we state two factors and did we explain how they influence the weather? Well, let's see, we have pressure belts here, and then I explained how pressure belts affect the weather. And then I have one here, the Lake Erie, and then I put how Lake Erie affects the weather. Another thing I want you to pay attention to is that this is 4 points. That number of points can give you a good indication of how many sentences you're going to write or how many pieces there are to the question. So pay attention to that. So we're going to move forward. I'm going to tell you, we'll just read this quickly in case you do see a question about weather. So we have proximity to large bodies of water, or lack of proximity to water. Elevation or latitude affects average temperatures. Different latitudes receive sunlight at different angles, and proximity to mountains. So let's see. This is a really good question as an example of thinking through exactly what they're asking you and looking for keywords. So rising ocean temperatures can cause corals to expel the symbiotic algae on which they depend for survival. Which human influence could be responsible for an increase in this phenomenon? I'm going to take out my, so I can show you a couple of things here, because this question could be confusing, right? We have shoreline erosion, burning fossil fuels, solar power generation, or interjection of non-native species. Now there's some keywords in here you really need to pay attention to. We're looking for rising ocean temperatures, and we're looking for human influence, right? Because some of these are one or the other, but not both. So shoreline erosion, that's a very natural phenomenon, and does and is not caused by human influence. It also doesn't even cause ocean temperatures to rise. So that's kind of your throwaway answer. And they'll always have a throwaway answer, by the way, that one that just doesn't make sense. We have burning fossil fuels will probably, remember, fossil fuels are the burning of oil, coal, and natural gas. They're the fossils that are deep within our earth. And when we burn them, they cause a lot of damage. It's probably burning fossil fuels. Solar power generation. Do we use solar power generation? Sure, but do we use solar power generation to make our rising ocean temperatures? Absolutely not. So that doesn't quite make sense. Introduction of non-native species. This is actually not a terrible answer if you're just looking at the expelling symbiotic algae, because an introduction of non-native species could definitely disrupt that process. But do they make rising ocean temperatures? Absolutely not. So can human influence also be a part of this introduction of non-native species? Yes, they could. Absolutely. They do this all the time, by dumping like fish or things like that into places where they don't belong. And they can sometimes take over the biodiversity in an area. But it is burning fossil fuels. You're going to get fossil fuel questions on every single test, and it's always about rising temperatures. It is a human influence, and it is very destructive. So burning fossil fuels. So we'll go over this one so I can also take your panic out of looking at a graph. Every time you see a graph on the Science OGT, it is going to be pretty simple and pretty straightforward. All the time. I haven't actually ever seen a complicated graph on these. So don't be scared of these or intimidated. They're pretty straightforward almost all of the time. A student records the position of a car every second for a period of time and plots the following displacement and time graph. What did I tell you to do before? You're going to pay attention to the graph before you look at the answer. You have displacement, which is another word for movement, versus time. So you have displacement here. So movement in meters and time in seconds. Looks like she's just plotting along, right? So if you look at this, illustrated below is the change in the position of a car every second. Which observation of an object moving from left to right did the student record? Is it A, B, C, or D? The only viable answer here is A. And it's just exactly what each one of you actually thought in your mind when you looked at these, was it has to be A. These other ones make zero sense. And when you get on the OGTs, they do this a lot. It's the answer right in front of you. And it seems too easy, and they want to try to get you to overthink it. But if you would have to think really hard for any of these to make sense. They're too random. There's no indication that any of these three are correct. So let's see what we have. I've talked about this. This is one way they ask the question about Alfred Wegener. So we're going to look at this. Scientists have hypothesized for years that Earth's continents once formed a single landmass that broke apart and became the continents as we know them today. The model below shows the landmasses Gondwanaland as they started to break apart to form South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. What evidence best supports the model proposed above? Igneous rocks have been found on all the continents. Similar fossils have been found in parts of Africa and South America. Australia has a marsupial species that are not found on other continents, or indications of sea level changes have been recorded on all the continents. The answer is definitely B. And if you remember us talking about Alfred Wegener and his single landmass theory, we talked about similar fossils in this area. And so this absolutely supports the model that they're talking about up here. You want to be careful here when you read answers to questions that your answer is supporting exactly what they're asking. And so a lot of times it's a good idea to reread your answer before you move on and make sure it makes sense. So the model below shows the land masses Gondwanaland, which is, if you remember, just the stage in which the single landmass started breaking apart. As they started to break apart to form South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia, what evidence best supports the model proposed? Similar fossils have been found in parts of Africa and South America. Does that make sense? Yes. Does that check off? Yes. A really good indication that you're being asked a single landmass question, which they ask on every single OGT test. They ask this question in one form or another, is are they listing off different continents that are separated now? Are they mentioning Gondwanaland or Pangaea or Alfred Wegener's name? If any of those elements are in the question, it's always a single landmass question. And remember, there's the similar fossils. There's a similar geologic record that they can find through rocks. Remember that question? And there's just a few different ways, and you'll run into these as you go through the practice test. But that is a concept you need to understand for sure. So take your pen and paper, get it ready. I'm going to give you some clues on how to understand this question and its answer. A student walks from inside an air-conditioned building to stand outside on a sunny, sandy beach. The student says that their face and the bottoms of her feet feel warm. Which statement best describes the thermal energy taking place? Now, for a moment, just close your eyes. I want you to imagine what's happening here. There's a girl, she's inside an air-conditioned building. She goes outside and she's standing on a sunny, sandy beach. And then she says that her face and the bottoms of her feet feel warm. So they're asking you what kind of heat energy is taking place. Is thermal energy or heat transferred to her face by radiation, and heat is transferred to the bottoms of her feet by radiation? Heat is transferred to her face by convection, and heat is transferred to the bottoms of her feet by radiation. Heat is transferred to her face by radiation, and heat is transferred to the bottoms of her feet by conduction. Or thermal energy or heat is transferred to her face by conduction, and thermal energy is transferred to the bottoms of her feet by conduction. Well, her face is most likely being or is being warmed up by the sun. So you know that that is by radiation, right? Because radiation is the sun. That's what's it's the light waves in the form of radiation heating up her face. So it is radiation. Now, what's warming up the bottom of her feet? Is that also the sun shining directly on her feet? Probably not. So remember I told you you would see the word convection. Again, here it is. Convection is the transfer of heat through liquid. And if you remember that circular motion in the mantle of the earth, in that context, we were talking about tectonic activity, but convection is literally just the transfer of heat or the movement of heat through liquid. And remember I talked about the pan of boiling water and it's moving in that circular motion. So is her face being heated by convection? Absolutely not. And the bottoms of her feet by radiation. Again, the sun's not directly warming her feet. So heat is transferred to her face by radiation, so by the sun, and heat is transferred to the bottoms of her feet by conduction. And this is where I want you to write. So I want you to write down convection, transfer of heat through liquid. Conduction is the transfer of heat through touch. So where her bottom of her feet are touching the sand, that's most likely, it is actually how the heat is being transferred to her feet through conduction, through her feet touching the sand. I always remember conduction. Conduction rhymes with touch, conduct, touch. Okay, that's how I remember the difference. The differences. So convection, to convect means to go back and forth. So I remember convection that way, and conduction is conduct, touch. Okay, so this is the answer. But those will give you some good keywords and some good tricks when you come across a question about heat transfer. So here we have a question about isotopic dating, radioactive isotope dating. This is used to date things, elements within the earth. And so it's kind of complicated. I will just very briefly explain what this stuff is. You don't really need to know it, though, to get the answer at all. And honestly, they don't expect you to know any of this. Like, who knows that? Probably geologists, but not a lot of other people. Same over here. So this answer is super easy. I'm going to show you how to answer questions that you don't quite know. And remember, they don't expect you to know all these terms. So the answer has to be right in front of you. We have radioactive isotopes here. We have a list here. Down here we have a legend. So BY is billions of years, MY is millions of years. So you got potassium, rubidium, thorium, uranium, and carbon. But here we've got some interesting things. We got 1.25 billion years, 48 billion, 14 billion, 4 billion, 704 million, and then this guy, 5,730 years. Now this is the half-life. So you can, what that actually means in the context of this question is that these elements have decayed, have halfway decayed, and whatever element they're looking at, this has halfway decayed in it. That's how they can date it, is how much of this of potassium 40 is still in this element. And sometimes after the half-life, sometimes they decay and turn into different elements at that point because their chemical composition changes. But it's interesting here that you got billions, billions, millions, and then something just 5,000 years seems kind of shady to me. Like it's kind of odd. Also, the one thing is carbon 14, just so you know, is always used to date fossils, like animal fossils, anything that's ever lived, because all living things have carbon in them. So here we have a partial Cenozoic timescale. Here's the period, it's the Quaternary period epoch, and we're going to date something that's here in this Holocene period that's only 10,000 years old. Your key, it's only 10,000 years old. There's literally only one answer that can fit here that where it makes any sense. So which isotope from table A is the only one with applications for dating Holocene materials? Well, it's carbon 14. It's the only thing that's dated in years. So it's the only thing that makes any sense that can date something that's 10,000 years, right? Remember, this is its half-life. So halfway, this is at 5,000. Okay, so when you see this, I remember when I first looked at this question, I had no idea what any of this meant. I just noticed that I only had one radioactive isotope here that was in years, and I knew I was dating something in years. This was the only one that made sense to me. And you need to look at a lot of these questions exactly like that. Don't overthink them. If they don't make sense to you, stop and review your question. Okay, so let's skip this one. We do need to practice those, but we're going to skip that one. Okay, color blindness is a sex-linked trait that is carried on the X chromosome. If a boy is born blind, what would have to be true? So first you need to know that the X chromosome is the female chromosome. You might want to write that down. So I know this is not great, but I remember X chromosome is female because it kind of looks like a dress. I don't know if that's even real, but X chromosome is the female, Y is male. Okay, so what would have to be true for if color blindness is a sex-linked trait that's carried on the female chromosome? His father had normal vision. His grandmother was colorblind. His mother carried at least one gene for color blindness, or his grandfather passed on the colorblind trait to his father. Well, it is his mother carried at least one gene for color blindness. So if you knew that the X chromosome was a female chromosome, you should have automatically whittled down the answers to the grandmother or the mother. But then you got to remember that the mother just needs one allele. If you remember the video, we talked about that for color blindness, right? So even if his grandmother was colorblind, she would have the allele for sure, but the mother would have to have it and the father in order for color blindness to be expressed. But just remember X chromosome female and that the mother carries on color blindness. This question is a good example of questions eliminating each other. Okay, on which map do the shaded land areas represent regions where the average annual temperature is greater than 18 degrees or 64 degrees Celsius? Now, if your average annual temperature is 64 degrees, that's pretty warm, right? So you know that this is not going to be the coldest regions in the world, which is right up here. I think it probably doesn't get anywhere colder than this where humans actually live. So you have Siberia up here, which is where they used to send Russian POWs to die of the cold. And then you have Greenland here and then Canada here, which is just freezing cold. Average annual temperature is absolutely not 64 degrees. And then we got the equator here. Remember, I don't know if you guys remember the equator belt, warmest temperatures on Earth because of the way our Earth rotates on its axis. Everything on the equator belt is going to be very warm and tropical. So, and then here, this is just all over the place. You automatically know to throw that one in the garbage. And the problem with this one is we've got some of the same areas up here that are the coldest regions on the planet. And they're including this answer too. This is canceled out. This is canceled out. This one's crazy. The answer is B. It's right here just below the equator. The actual average temperature around the equator belt is about 76 degrees. This is a little bit cooler because it's a little bit south of the equator. So we're going to do just a couple more. I don't want you guys to get bored. There's a lot more we need to go over. I'll separate the videos so that you guys can watch them in increments and kind of absorb what you're learning, number one, and then not getting too bored. I do understand some of this is boring, but you need to be excited about science. It's your world. So anyway. Solid copper wire is a good conductor because copper contains no protons. Electrons move easily within the wire. Protons and electrons tend to cluster at opposite ends of it, or copper contains the same number of protons and neutrons. Well, the answer to this one is B. If you remember, I said electrons are always going to be the conductor. They always conduct electricity, they conduct heat. Electrons are the elements within an atom that move everything. Everything has protons. You know that's not an answer. That's your throwaway. Everything has protons. If you remember the periodic table, the protons are that number right up above the symbol, the element symbol. Everything has protons. Protons and electrons tend to cluster at opposite ends. That doesn't even make sense because protons attract electrons. They're what holds the atoms together. Copper contains the same number of protons and neutrons. Well, if that's true, it's doing nothing, right? It's absolutely a paralyzing answer. The answer is B. All right, we're going to stop here. Question 23. We'll pick up on the next test or on the next session. So, as always, reach out to me if you have any questions. Hopefully, this is helping you think through answers. The OGTs have like a few tricks that they routinely use, and it's if you can figure out what those are, then you're one step ahead. Anyway, have a great day. Thanks for listening.